I tore up the $50,000 check and replaced it with adoption papers. Not the reaction most fathers have at their daughter's wedding, I suppose. But sitting here now in my recliner, the empty checkbook on my lap, and my fingers still cramped from all that writing, I can't say I have any regrets. Just a bone-deep weariness, and underneath it all, a sense that I finally did right by my real daughter. The ceiling fan above me squeaks with each rotation. Been meaning to fix that for years. The same worn carpet I installed back in '98 still covers the floor, and the kitchen table where I signed those papers earlier this morning has a wobble I've adjusted with folded cardboard more times than I can count. This little ranch house isn't much, but it's paid for. Every nail, every repair, every mortgage payment came from 43 years at the plant before they shut it down and gave us those silver watches as parting gifts. That money was everything I had, my retirement fund, my safety net. But watching Melissa's face when she opened that envelope at the reception, expecting to find the check I'd promised since she was in college, that told me everything I needed to know. The shock, the rage, the way she stood up and announced to everyone that I was pulling a sick joke and how typical it was of me to ruin her special day. What the guests didn't know was that 3 days before the wedding, I'd discovered the truth. The adoption papers had been hidden in my late wife's hope chest all these years, tucked beneath her wedding dress. I'd finally been clearing it out, 17 years after losing her to cancer, when I found them. Papers showing that Melissa, the girl I'd raised as my daughter for 32 years, wasn't biologically mine, not even close. But there was something else in that envelope I gave her, something that explained why I couldn't in good conscience hand over that money. The second set of adoption papers, newer ones, showing that I'd redirected those funds to finalize the adoption of a 14-year-old girl named Kimberly. A girl who'd been in foster care for 9 years. A girl who, according to the DNA test results I also included, shares 27% of my genetic material. My actual biological granddaughter. The wedding reception dissolved into chaos after that. Melissa screaming that I'd lost my mind, her new husband trying to calm her down while shooting daggers at me with his eyes. My brother Frank, the only one who knew what I was planning, helping me to the door as guests whispered and stared. I didn't fight it, just walked out with what dignity a 64-year-old man with arthritis in both knees could muster. The phone's been ringing all afternoon. I haven't answered. The red light on my ancient answering machine blinks accusingly from across the room. 27 messages and counting. I'll deal with them tomorrow. Tonight, I just need to sit with this decision and prepare for what comes next. Tomorrow, I'll drive to the group home where Kimberly's been staying. The social worker says she's cautiously excited to meet me. I've got her room ready, painted it myself last week. Light blue, like the sky. I don't know much about teenage girls these days, but I figure we can sort out the details together. What I do know is that she deserves a chance, and somehow, after all these years, I've been given one too. I closed the checkbook and set it on the side table. The decision's been made. Now I just need to understand how we got here, how 32 years of what I thought was fatherhood led to this moment. And it starts with the day I met Caroline, back when we were both too young to imagine any of this. It was one of those restaurants where the menu doesn't list prices. If you have to ask, you can't afford it. That's what they say. I knew I couldn't afford it, but I didn't ask. My daughter Melissa had chosen Bellini's for this dinner to discuss her wedding plans. Neutral territory, she'd called it, though there was nothing neutral about a place where the valet Parkers wore better suits than the one I'd bought for my wife's funeral. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always do. Old habits from 30 years of construction work. The maitre d' looked me up and down, taking in my department store blazer and the hands that no amount of scrubbing could ever get completely clean, before reluctantly showing me to the table. I ordered water while I waited, not wanting to see what a beer might cost in a place like this. When Melissa arrived with her fiancé, James, they were laughing about something. She looked beautiful, confident in a way her mother would have been proud to see. James nodded at me with that practiced smile, Lawyers perfect. Firm handshake, direct eye contact, not a hint of warmth. He'd made partner at 34 at one of those firms with 3 names that sound like old money. "Dad, you didn't have to get here so early," Melissa said, kissing my cheek. I caught a whiff of perfume that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Kiri, just excited to hear about the plans," I said, which was true. What I didn't say was that I'd been saving for her wedding since she was born. A little each month, through lean times and good, through her mother's illness and after. Not a fortune, but enough, I thought, to give her a nice start. James ordered wine without consulting the list, something French that the sommelier nodded approvingly at. I took a sip when it arrived and pretended to appreciate it. "So we've been looking at venues," Melissa began, pulling out her phone to show me pictures of places that looked like European castles. "The Westlake Country Club is our favorite. They only do a few weddings a year." James nodded. "My father thinks it's the obvious choice. He's friends with several board members." I nodded, calculating rapidly in my head. The wedding fund I'd built would cover maybe half of just the venue, from what I could tell. "James's dad has been so generous," Melissa continued. "He's contributing $50,000 to start, and he said he'll cover any overages on the venue and catering." "That's very generous," I managed, feeling the first twist of something in my stomach. "Well, he wants to make sure it's done right," James said, not quite looking at me. "Family reputation and all that." I nodded again, taking another sip of the wine I couldn't taste anymore. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I took a wrong turn and ended up near a small alcove just off the main dining room. I was about to turn back when I heard Melissa's laugh. She and James had apparently stepped away to take a call. "No, Dad's being Dad," she was saying. "You know how he is, quiet, simple. I don't think he understands the scale of what we're planning." A pause. "I know, but he worked construction his whole life. The Westlake would be like another planet to him." Another laugh. "James's father is handling the important stuff. Dad can contribute what he can. Maybe the rehearsal dinner at some place appropriate." I stood there, frozen. 30 years of packing my own lunches, of driving cars until they died, of putting off replacing my work boots until they were falling apart. 30 years of college first, then we'll see about that new roof. 30 years of promising her mother on her deathbed that I'd make sure Melissa had everything she needed. All dismissed as simple, all reduced to what he can, which clearly wasn't much in their estimation. I walked back to the table with the same steady pace I'd maintained, walking steel beams 20 stories up. Face neutral, shoulders square. I'd spent a lifetime hiding fatigue, pain, and worry. This was no different. When I sat down, they were discussing flowers. I smiled and nodded in all the right places. I even managed to genuinely admire the ring when James mentioned its appraisal value. But something had shifted inside me, like a support beam developing a hairline fracture, not visible yet, but fundamentally compromised. That night, I looked at my wedding fund balance, $27,136.18. Not enough to impress anyone at the Westlake Country Club, but enough to make me reconsider everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my daughter. After Marie passed, I had to become both mother and father to our little girl. Cassie was only 4 then, still asking when Mommy was coming home from heaven. Those first months, I'd sit on the edge of her bed each night, stroking her hair until she fell asleep. Then I'd go to the kitchen table and spread out the bills, trying to make the numbers work. Marie's medical bills had drained what little savings we had. Our insurance covered some, but nowhere near enough. I took the midnight shift at the auto plant because it paid an extra $1.50 an hour. For almost 30 years, I worked those hours, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., coming home just in time to get Cassie ready for school. I'd catch maybe 3 hours of sleep before picking up handyman jobs around the neighborhood. Fixing leaky faucets, patching roofs, whatever paid cash. Weekends, I'd mow lawns in summer and shovel driveways in winter. Every dollar went into an old coffee can labeled Cassie's Future. Jail, There were nights on the assembly line when my eyes would burn from exhaustion, my fingers numb from the repetitive motion of installing the same dashboard components hour after hour. The foreman, Bill, would sometimes find me splashing cold water on my face in the bathroom. "You're killing yourself, Frank," he'd say. Maybe I was, but what choice did I have? I remember Cassie's first school play. She was in second grade, playing a sunflower. I'd worked a double shift, then fixed Mrs. Henley's garbage disposal, and hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. I sat in that uncomfortable folding chair in the elementary school gymnasium, fighting to keep my eyes open. When Cassie came on stage in that bright yellow costume Marie would have loved, I felt a surge of energy. She spotted me and beamed. That smile carried me through another week of exhaustion. As the years passed, I never missed a parent-teacher conference, a softball game, or a school concert. Sometimes I'd be standing there in my work clothes, grease still under my fingernails, nodding off between innings. But I was there. The other parents probably thought I was strange, this perpetually tired man who sometimes smelled like motor oil at the school bake sale. But Cassie knew I was trying my best. When college application time came around, Cassie worried about the cost. "Maybe I should just go to community college, Dad," she suggested one night at dinner. I pulled out that coffee can, now replaced by a shoebox full of bank statements. I'd been putting away money since she was 4, skipping lunches, never buying new clothes for myself, living in the same small house with the leaky roof I kept patching instead of replacing. It wasn't enough for Harvard, but it was enough for State University. "Shishmo, your mother wanted you to have every opportunity," I told her. "This is what all those years were for." What I didn't tell her was that at 52, I had exactly $200 in my retirement account. The financial advisor at the plant had stopped giving me concerned looks years ago and just started avoiding eye contact altogether during our annual reviews. The night before Cassie left for college, I found her in Marie's old sewing room looking through a photo album. "Dad," she said, "did you ever think about remarrying, having a normal life?" I sat beside her, looking at a picture of Marie holding infant Cassie. "This was my normal," I told her. "You were my normal." It was the truth. Whatever dreams I might have had for myself died with Marie, replaced by a single purpose: giving our daughter the life her mother would have wanted for her. When Cassie graduated with honors in psychology, I sat in that audience wearing the only suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to Marie's funeral 18 years earlier. It barely fit anymore. My hands were calloused, my back permanently stooped from decades of physical labor. But watching my daughter accept that diploma, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced since before Marie got sick. Maybe I'd given up a lot, but sitting there that day, I couldn't think of a single sacrifice I regretted. What I didn't know then was how quickly things would change once Cassie started her own life and career, or how the choices I'd made would come back to haunt us both. The Oak Ridge Country Club was exactly what you'd expect. Manicured lawns that stretched to the horizon, a colonial-style clubhouse with white columns, and staff who seemed trained to detect the difference between old money and new. I felt out of place the moment I stepped out of my 10-year-old Chevy. The valet's quick glance said everything his polite smile didn't. Melissa, the wedding planner, greeted us in the grand foyer. She was all angles, sharp bob haircut, crisp pantsuit, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, so lovely to see you again," she cooed to my daughter's future in-laws before turning to me with a noticeably cooler, "And Mr. Wilson, thank you for joining us today." We toured the reception hall, a cavernous space with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my house. When I suggested we might save some money by using fewer floral arrangements on the tables, Melissa's eyebrows arched so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "Dad," Jessica hissed, her cheeks flushing pink, "the centerpieces are non-negotiable. We've already discussed this." Melissa placed a manicured hand on my daughter's arm. "Your vision is absolutely exquisite, Jessica. The cascading orchids will be simply breathtaking against the champagne linens." Then, with a sideways glance at me, "Some people just don't understand the importance of presentation." I bit my tongue and nodded, watching Jessica beam at the planner's approval. This wasn't the daughter I raised, the girl who once helped me rebuild the engine of her first car, who wore my old flannel shirts around the house, who used to say that fancy meant uncomfortable. When we moved to the tasting room, I suggested we consider a local brewery I knew that made excellent craft beer. The silence that followed was deafening. "Oh my," Melissa tittered, exchanging a look with Mrs. Caldwell. "I don't believe we've ever served brewery beer at Oak Ridge." Jessica leaned toward Melissa and whispered something that made them both smile. Then my daughter straightened up and said loudly, "We'll stick with the premium champagne package, Melissa. My father doesn't realize this isn't a backyard barbecue." The Caldwells chuckled politely. I felt my face grow hot, not from embarrassment, but from the slow-burning realization that my daughter was ashamed of me, of where she came from. Throughout the afternoon, the pattern continued. Every suggestion I made was met with whispers between Jessica and Melissa, followed by polite dismissals. When I mentioned that my brother could DJ the reception, he'd done weddings professionally for years, Jessica practically recoiled. "Dad, please," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "We're not having some weekend warrior with speakers from a garage sale. The Caldwell's friends expect a certain standard." Melissa nodded sympathetically at Jessica. "It's so difficult when families don't understand the level of sophistication required." She didn't even bother to pretend I wasn't meant to hear it. By the time we reached the discussion about place settings, apparently the difference between the $400 and $600 china pattern was obvious to everyone but me. I had stopped offering input. I just watched as my daughter transformed before my eyes, adopting the mannerisms and prejudices of people who would have never given her the time of day before she became engaged to their son. On the way out, Jessica hung back with Melissa while the Caldwells walked ahead to their Mercedes. I overheard the wedding planner say, "Don't worry, we can work around your father's limitations. The Caldwells understand. It's not your fault where you came from." Chaffee. My daughter didn't defend me. She just nodded gratefully and squeezed Melissa's hand. Driving home alone, I realized I wasn't just paying for a wedding. I was financing my daughter's rejection of everything I was, everything I'd built my life around. And I began to wonder if I should keep my checkbook open for someone who seemed to want my money but not my presence. The bank was eerily quiet at 7:30 in the morning. I'd specifically requested the earliest appointment possible, partly because I didn't want to run into anyone I knew, but mostly because I needed to get this done before I lost my nerve. The loan officer, Mr. Patel, had his desk lamp on, the soft yellow glow a stark contrast to the gray morning light filtering through the blinds. He looked as tired as I felt. My house, the one Frank and I had scraped and saved for 30 years ago, was about to become collateral for my daughter's happiness. At least that's what I told myself as Mr. Patel slid the refinancing papers across his desk. My arthritis was acting up something fierce that morning, making my fingers stiff and uncooperative. The pen felt impossibly heavy. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mr. Patel said, his voice gentle but concerned, "I want to make absolutely certain you understand what you're doing here. You're taking on significant new debt at a time when most people your age are eliminating debt." "Yeah." I nodded, trying to keep my hand steady as I flipped through the pages. "I understand the terms, Mr. Patel." "Your fixed income?" He hesitated, glancing down at my financial statements. "It doesn't leave much room for these new payments, and with the interest rate we're able to offer." "I've done the math," I interrupted, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "I can manage it if I'm careful." What I didn't tell him was that being careful meant cutting my medications in half some months, or that the thermostat would stay at 62 degrees through the winter. Some sacrifices weren't meant for loan officers' ears. He sighed, then pointed to the bottom of page 4. "Initial here, acknowledging the prepayment penalties." His finger moved to another spot. "And here, confirming you understand the new monthly obligation." My hand trembled visibly as I signed my name over and over. With each signature, I could feel the safety net I'd built over decades growing thinner. Frank would have called me a damn fool. Maybe I was. But when your only child announces she's finally getting married at 38 after you've given up hope of ever seeing her settled, you do foolish things. The final signature was the hardest. My pen hovered above the line as I thought about what this money would mean for Melissa. A proper wedding, a decent down payment on a house, a fresh start with that fiancé of hers who I still wasn't entirely sure about. My hand shook so badly I had to steady my wrist with my other hand. "There," I said, pushing the papers back across the desk. "It's done." Mr. Patel nodded solemnly. "The funds should be in your account within 3 business days, Mrs. Caldwell." I walked out of that bank feeling lighter and heavier all at once. $65,000 would soon be mine to give. The monthly payment notice on my refrigerator would soon be $437 higher. For the next 15 years. I called Melissa from the parking lot, my hands still trembling as I dialed. I wanted to hear the joy in her voice when I told her about her wedding gift. I needed that confirmation that I'd done the right thing. "Mom, it's not even 8 o'clock, she answered, her voice thick with sleep and irritation. "I'm sorry to call so early, honey. I just wanted to tell you some good news about your wedding gift." "Mom, I told you we don't expect anything extravagant, just whatever you can manage." I swallowed hard. "Well, that's just it. I've arranged something special, something to help you and David get started." "Look, I've got to get ready for work," she cut in. "David's parents are already being overbearing about the whole wedding planning thing. I don't need you competing with them, okay? We're trying to keep this simple." The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, illuminating the mortgage papers on the passenger seat beside me. 15 years of payments starting next month. "Of course, dear," I said quietly. "We can talk about it another time." As I drove home, I wondered if I should have listened to Frank's voice in my head after all. But it was too late now. The papers were signed, the die was cast. All I could do was hope that when Melissa saw the check, she'd understand what it had cost me. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally see how much I loved her. I found out by accident. That's the part that still stings after all these weeks. Not a conversation, not a phone call, just a stray email notification that popped up on Melissa's laptop when she asked me to look up a recipe while she was in the shower. Wedding venue deposit confirmation, paid in full. The sender? Robert Caldwell, my son-in-law's father. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I shouldn't have clicked it, but there it was, confirmation that Robert had paid for the entire wedding. Every last penny. The venue, catering, flowers, photographer, even the honeymoon. A package worth nearly $60,000. The email thread showed Melissa's enthusiastic acceptance from 3 days earlier, complete with multiple exclamation points and effusive thanks to her future father-in-law for his incredible generosity. 3 days earlier, the same day I'd called my mortgage company to arrange the refinancing. The same day I'd told her I'd found a way to help with the wedding costs. She'd hugged me, told me how much it meant to her, and all along, she'd already accepted Robert's offer. I closed the laptop and sat there in the kitchen, listening to the shower running upstairs. The house felt suddenly foreign, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. I'd just committed to 15 more years of mortgage payments at my age. 15 years of working past when I should retire. For nothing. When Melissa came downstairs, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I mumbled something about needing to run errands and left. What would I even say? That I felt betrayed? That she should have told me? That I'd just made a massive financial decision based on a promise that apparently meant nothing to her? I drove around for hours, eventually ending up at the park where I used to take her as a child. I sat on a bench, watching families with young children, wondering where exactly I'd gone wrong. Had I raised her to be this thoughtless? Or was this just who she'd always been, and I'd been too blind to see it? That night, after she'd gone to bed, I went down to the basement and pulled out the old fireproof lockbox I keep behind the water heater. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were the documents that marked the major milestones of my life: birth certificates, my marriage license, property deeds, and underneath them all, in a sealed manila envelope that had yellowed with age, the adoption papers. I sat on the concrete floor, papers spread around me like fallen leaves, and read through them again. Melissa had been 6 months old when she came to us. Her birth mother was just 17, father unknown. The social worker had told us she was a miracle baby, that we'd been chosen because we could provide the stable home her birth mother wanted for her. My wife and I had agreed we would tell Melissa when she was old enough to understand, but somehow the right moment never came. Then, after my wife passed, it felt like a burden I couldn't place on a grieving teenager. Now, holding these papers in my trembling hands, I wondered if knowing might have changed something fundamental in our relationship. Would she have valued my sacrifices more if she knew I'd chosen her? Or would it only have confirmed what her actions suggested, that blood ties were what really mattered, and I was just the man who happened to raise her? I traced my finger over the signature on the last page. My name, 32 years younger. A promise to love and protect this child as my own. And I had. Every day, through every skinned knee and broken heart, through college tuition and late-night phone calls about car troubles. I'd been there. As I carefully folded the papers and returned them to their envelope, I wondered if it was finally time to tell her the truth. Not as a weapon or punishment for her betrayal, but because maybe, just maybe, it might help her understand who she really was and who I was to her. The wedding was in 3 weeks. Whatever I decided, I needed to do it soon. The Blue Water Grill was decked out in white roses and navy ribbons when I arrived for Melissa's rehearsal dinner. I'd spent an extra 20 minutes in the hotel making sure my suit was perfect, pressing out a stubborn wrinkle, polishing my shoes one more time. I wanted everything to be right. After all the tension of the past months, I hoped this evening might offer some healing. The hostess checked her list when I gave my name. "Oh, Mr. Harmon, you're at table 7. She gestured toward the back corner of the restaurant. I glanced at the main table where Melissa sat with her fiancé, his parents, and several others I didn't recognize. There was an empty chair, and for a moment I thought perhaps they were saving it for me after all. I made my way to table 7, nodding at a few distant relatives and Melissa's college roommate. They seemed surprised to see me relegated to what was clearly the obligation invites section. From my seat, I had a clear view of the head table, where Melissa was laughing at something her future father-in-law had said. The empty chair remained vacant for another 10 minutes until a latecomer arrived, Robert's uncle from Seattle. The father of the bride had never been meant to sit at the main table at all. The waiter brought our salads, and I pushed the greens around my plate while watching Gerald Thompson, Robert's father, lean in close to my daughter. He was a successful orthopedic surgeon, the kind of man who commanded respect without trying. I'd met him only twice before, and each time he'd regarded me with the polite disinterest one might show to a delivery person. Tonight he wore an expensive suit and kept his arm protectively around his wife, occasionally reaching over to pat Melissa's hand like she was already his daughter. When the time came for toasts, Robert stood first, thanking everyone for coming. Then Melissa rose, champagne flute in hand, her face glowing in the candlelight. "I want to thank the people who have made this wedding possible," she began. "Gerald and Diana, you've welcomed me into your family with such warmth. You've shown me what true parental support looks like." She turned toward them with a smile that made my chest ache. "The way you've guided us through every decision, from the venue to the honeymoon plans, I couldn't ask for more wonderful in-laws." I waited for her to acknowledge me, to say something, anything, about her actual father who had driven 4 hours to be here, who had offered to help with expenses despite my modest income. But she simply raised her glass. To family, old and new. The room echoed with "to family" as glasses clinked. At my table, a cousin's wife gave me a sympathetic glance. I nodded slightly and took a sip of my water, leaving my champagne untouched. I wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me drink to my own erasure. Shatters. Throughout dinner, I maintained what I hoped was a dignified expression. I answered questions about my drive up from Portland, commented on the weather, complimented the food. All the while, I watched Gerald Thompson perform the role that should have been mine, accepting congratulations, shaking hands with guests who stopped by the main table, standing for photos with the happy couple. As dessert was served, I excused myself to use the restroom. In the quiet hallway, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. The laughter from the dining room continued without me. I thought about tomorrow's ceremony, about walking Melissa down the aisle to hand her over to a family that had already claimed her. I thought about the father-daughter dance we'd never practiced, the speech I wasn't asked to give. When I returned to the table, the celebration was in full swing. Someone had pushed tables aside to create a small dance floor. Melissa was twirling in Gerald Thompson's arms, her head thrown back in laughter. Watching them, I made my decision. I wouldn't make a scene or demand recognition, but I wouldn't pretend any more either. Tomorrow would be different. I just had to find the courage to do what needed to be done. The wedding reception was in full swing at the Lakeside Pavilion. White linens, crystal glasses, and centerpieces of hydrangeas and roses adorned each table. I sat at the far end of the head table, nursing a glass of water, watching Harold work the room. My ex-wife's father had somehow positioned himself as the master of ceremonies, though no one had asked him to. The DJ kept deferring to him, as if Harold were the one paying the bills. He wasn't. That would be me. I'd written the checks for everything: the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer. The whole affair had cost more than my first car. But Melissa had wanted her daughter to have the wedding she'd always dreamed of, and I'd agreed. After all, I'd raised Caitlin since she was 4. 23 years of school plays, soccer games, and late-night talks about boys who weren't good enough for her. Harold tapped his knife against his champagne flute, the crystal ping cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." His voice boomed across the hall, practiced and commanding. He'd been a car salesman for 40 years before retiring to Florida, and he still had that way of filling a room. "As the father of the mother of the bride," he began, emphasizing each word as if staking a claim, "I want to propose a toast to my beautiful granddaughter on her special day." I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression neutral. Harold had barely been present for most of Caitlin's life. He'd show up for graduations with expensive gifts and take all the credit, but he wasn't there for the chicken pox, the broken arm from falling off the swing set, or the tearful college applications. He launched into a story about taking Caitlin fishing when she was 6, something that had happened exactly once on a family vacation I'd paid for. The way he told it, you'd think they'd gone every weekend. I glanced at Melissa, seated 3 chairs away. She was beaming at her father, nodding along as if every word were gospel. The photographer moved around the edge of the room, capturing Harold's animated gestures. I caught her eye briefly, and something in her expression told me she sensed the undercurrents. She'd been with us all day, had seen the family photos where Harold had pushed to stand next to Caitlin, nudging me to the edge of the frame. Harold raised his glass higher. "And now I'd like to ask my granddaughter to say a few words." Caitlin stood, radiant in her white dress, her cheeks flushed from champagne and excitement. She took the microphone, and I felt a surge of pride despite everything. She'd grown into such a poised young woman. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said, her voice catching slightly. "You know, when Mom and Dad split up, I was worried about today, about who would walk me down the aisle, who would dance with me." She paused, and I waited for her to acknowledge the conversation we'd had months ago when she'd asked me to do both. Instead, she turned to Harold. But then Grandpa stepped up in a way I never expected, and I realized that I finally have the father figure I always wanted. "Joe." The silence that followed was absolute. The DJ's hand froze over his equipment. The photographer slowly lowered her camera, her finger hovering over the shutter button, but not pressing down. Across the room, my sister Catherine's mouth fell open slightly before she composed herself. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't shock or even hurt, just clarity. 23 years of school events, bedtime stories, and teaching her to drive, erased in a single sentence. Harold broke the silence with a boisterous laugh, raising his glass higher. To my beautiful granddaughter and her new husband, may you have all the happiness in the world. So, the guests raised their glasses mechanically, murmuring the toast. A few glanced in my direction, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and pity. My brother-in-law David caught my eye from across the room and gave a small, sympathetic shake of his head. I waited until the music started again, and Harold led Caitlin to the dance floor, another tradition that should have been mine. Then I quietly stood, placed my napkin on the table, and walked toward the exit. No dramatic departure, no scene. Just a man who finally understood that some relationships couldn't be repaired, no matter how much you wished otherwise. Outside, the evening air was cool against my face. I loosened my tie and looked up at the stars, wondering what would come next. The wedding gift check was already given, the father-daughter dance clearly not happening. There was nothing left for me to do here. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out what my life looked like now that this chapter was closing. Back in my hotel room, I laid everything out on the desk with surgical precision. The cream-colored stationery I'd purchased from that little shop in Charleston 3 months ago, waiting for this moment. The golden wax seal kit I'd ordered online. The manila folder containing the adoption papers, originals I'd kept in a safety deposit box for 35 years. My hands didn't shake as I arranged them. I was beyond that now. I took out my fountain pen, the one Edward had given me on our 20th anniversary. The weight of it felt right as I began to write. No flowery language, no accusations. Just the truth, laid bare after all these years. Melissa, I wrote, these documents confirm what I've kept from you your entire life. You were adopted at birth. Your biological mother was 17, unmarried, and unable to care for you. That young woman was my sister, Catherine. She died 6 months after your birth from complications that were never fully explained to me. Your biological father was never in the picture. I paused, collecting my thoughts. The hotel air conditioning hummed in the background. Edward and I raised you as our own, and in every way that matters, you are our daughter. I never intended for you to discover this through such circumstances, but your actions have forced my hand. The trust fund you've been draining, it was Catherine's money, left specifically for your education and well-being. I've been its trustee all these years. I finished with a simple line. I hope someday you'll understand that love isn't just about blood, but about choices we make every day. I signed it simply, Margaret Shain. I folded the letter carefully and placed it atop the adoption certificate and birth records. The cream envelope felt substantial between my fingers as I slid everything inside. I melted the golden wax with methodical care, pressing my family seal into it, the same seal that had marked important family documents for generations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I wrote open immediately on the front in my best calligraphy. Some occasions demand formality, even painful ones. The walk back to the reception hall felt like crossing a threshold. Guests were dancing, the band playing something upbeat that contrasted sharply with my mood. I spotted the gift table, elaborately decorated with white roses and silver ribbon. I placed my envelope prominently against the 3-tiered wedding cake display where it couldn't be missed. I caught the eye of the wedding coordinator, a young woman with an earpiece and clipboard. "This needs to be delivered to the bride immediately," I said, my voice steady. "It's rather urgent family business." She nodded, professional enough not to question me. I watched as she retrieved the envelope and made her way across the room to where Melissa stood, laughing with her college friends, champagne flute in hand, radiant in her designer gown that I now knew had been purchased with Catherine's money. I could have left then, part of me wanted to, but I owed it to Catherine to see this through. Melissa's face changed as she accepted the envelope, recognition flickering as she saw the family seal. Our eyes met across the room. I didn't look away. She excused herself from her friends and stepped into a quiet alcove to open it. I watched as she read, her body growing still, then rigid. When she looked up, her face had drained of color. She moved toward me with the papers clutched in her hand, wedding guests parting unconsciously before her intensity. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" she whispered when she reached me, voice trembling. "You know it isn't," I replied quietly. "Why now? Why today of all days?" Tears welled in her eyes, smudging the perfect makeup. "Because you left me no choice. The trust fund is empty, Melissa. Your mother's legacy, gone." She grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. "Mom, please, we can talk about this. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about any of this." "You knew you were stealing," I said, gently removing her hand. "The rest is just details." "Xiao." As I walked away, I heard her calling after me, her voice breaking. "Mom, please don't go like this. Please, I'm sorry." But some apologies come too late. I had one more stop to make before I could truly put this chapter behind me. The morning sun caught the rearview mirror as I merged onto the highway, casting a golden glow across the dashboard of my packed sedan. My life had been distilled down to what fit in the trunk and back seat: clothes, a few books, my old record player, and a folder containing the cashier's check from the mortgage company. The weight of the house had been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by something I hadn't felt in decades: possibility. My phone buzzed again, the 5th time in the last hour. Melissa's name flashed on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Whatever urgent crisis she was manufacturing could wait. Maybe forever. The thought didn't bring the guilt I expected, just a calm certainty. The highway stretched before me, carrying me away from the neighborhood where I'd spent 30 years building a life for people who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. I'd left a note on the kitchen counter explaining that I'd paid off the mortgage and transferred the deed to her name. No strings attached. The house was hers, free and clear. I'd also left behind the recording of her and Mark's conversation, not out of spite, but so she'd understand why I was gone. Some truths need to be faced, even painful ones. The phone buzzed again. This time I reached over and switched it off completely. Whatever she wanted to say, accusations, apologies, demands, I didn't need to hear it. Not today. Maybe someday, but not now. The money that would have gone to that mortgage was now funding my second chance. I'd rented a small cottage near the coast, 3 hours from the city. Nothing fancy, but it had a porch facing the water and enough space for me to breathe. As the city skyline disappeared in my rearview mirror, I thought about what Harold had said at the diner that day. Family isn't just blood, it's who treats you like you matter. I was 72 years old and finally understanding the truth of those words. My neighbor Irene had hugged me goodbye this morning, slipping me a container of her famous oatmeal cookies for the road. The barista at my regular coffee shop had written, "We'll miss you, Mr. G," on my final cup. Even my doctor had called to make sure I had referrals for medical care in my new location. These were people who saw me, really saw me. Not as a wallet or a convenience, but as a person worth knowing. Worth remembering, worth caring about. That's what family is supposed to be. The highway miles rolled beneath my tires as I passed the county line. The traffic thinned, and the landscape opened up into rolling hills, dotted with farms and stands of oak trees. I rolled down the window, letting the fresh air rush in. My chest felt lighter with each mile. I'm not naive enough to think that starting over at my age will be easy. There will be lonely days ahead, quiet evenings, holidays spent on my own. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. For too many years, I'd been lonely in a full house, invisible in my own home. The road curved gently to the right, and I caught my first glimpse of the ocean on the horizon, a thin blue line separating earth and sky. I wasn't running away from something as much as I was driving toward something. Dignity, peace, and the chance to live whatever years I have left as myself, not as someone else's safety net. Shatters. I reached for one of Irene's cookies and smiled as I took a bite. The sweetness of oatmeal and raisins filled my mouth as I drove toward that blue horizon. The bitterness I'd carried for so long had finally begun to fade, replaced by something that felt remarkably like hope. Not the desperate hope of youth, but the measured optimism of someone who has seen enough of life to know that endings are also beginnings, if you're brave enough to turn the page.